Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the scramble to deter Russia and prepare for a potential Donald Trump presidency. NATO pushes all members to raise defense spending to 2% of GDP. The military governments of Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali announce a new confederation of Sahel states. How will this affect regional body ECOWAS's drive for free movement and trade across West Africa? And Boeing's plea deal with the US Justice Department. What lies ahead for the aviation giant? And how will Washington monitor the country's largest exporter? NATO leaders have met in Washington, D.C. to mark the 75th anniversary of the military alliance. But the celebrations come at a time of uncertainty over the U.S. presidential election in November and the Russia-Ukraine war. Members are under pressure to raise military spending to 2% of GDP. U.S. presidential contender Donald Trump has long demanded that European members should step up spending. Is higher defense spending, though, necessary at a time of economic uncertainty? We'll examine that further with our guest in just a few moments. But first, our defense editor, Alex Skatopoulos, looks at who's gaining from Europe's push for more weapons.
As NATO members push to arm themselves in the face of geopolitical uncertainty, German arms giant Rheinmetall stands out as a clear winner, with deal after deal propelling the company and its stock price to approach its all-time high of $582. And the numbers are staggering. Overall, total NATO spending increased by 11% in 2004, compared to 3% in 2023. On the 19th of June, the company received the biggest order in its history, $9.1 billion, to make artillery ammunition for the German army. So great is the demand for artillery shells, especially the 155mm round favoured by Western armies, that Rheinmetall recently opened up a factory in Ukraine and a second munitions plant in Germany to keep up with demand. Rheinmetall purchased Spanish munitions company Expal in August last year in anticipation of the huge deluge of orders that they would receive, a bet that has paid off. The Ukraine war is the driving force behind all the orders. Western militaries have re-evaluated what future armies will need, with tanks, air defences and vast amounts of ammunition being high on the wish list. And European defence companies are expanding to meet demand.
We have to
think long-term. I strongly believe that we need to empower Ukraine to be able to protect itself at some point. That's why we have to give them Western European technologies, NATO technologies. And Rheinmetall's proposal is to enable Ukraine to protect itself in the medium term.
On July 3rd, Rheinmetall signed a memorandum of understanding with Italian defence company Leonardo to help re-equip the Italian army with the latest generation Panther tanks and Lynx infantry fighting vehicles, in a deal the German press widely reported as being worth $21 billion. Added to this is the German army's order of 6,500 military trucks worth $3.8 billion, signed on July the 1st. It's easy to see why the German arms giant is riding high. Alex Skatopoulos, Counting the Cost, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining us now from Berlin is William Alberg, who's a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center. He's earlier worked on arms control, disarmament and European security at NATO, as well as the US government. William, good to have you with us. What do you make of NATO's push to get each member state to pay 2% of GDP? This is nothing new. It's been trying to do this for quite some time. Why 2%? Why not 1.5%? Why not 2.5%, 3%? Is 2% a realistic figure?
Well, I think you have to understand that if you go back to 2004 or 2008, you were talking about European NATO members spending around an average of 1.5% a year. So at that time, it seemed reasonable to say that we should set some target that's above 1.5%, because at the time, actual European defense capabilities were totally collapsing. The idea of any European state being able to defend its own territory against a Russian attack was just unthinkable at that point. So 2% was a nice guideline to try to reach. And so we went from, in 2014, a very small number of allies being able to meet that total, to now we have, I think it's 23 are going to meet that total as of 2024. Yeah, in 2014 there were 3, now there's 23. And you also have to figure, in the Middle East, a country like Saudi Arabia or Qatar is spending around 7% on defense. So 2% doesn't seem like too much to ask.
OK, but is that going to be enough? to fund NATO, given the challenges that NATO currently faces?
I think so, because if you think about how big the European economies are, if all 32 allies reach 2%, you're talking about a massive increase from even where we are now, where, as I said, 23 allies will meet that total. But I think you're also right. There are countries like Poland and the Baltics and Finland and the Czech Republic where they exceed 2% because the threat to them is so acute. And so I think more allies reaching that total will provide more capabilities. But you're absolutely right. Even if they all met that total tomorrow, I think you'd still have to reassess where we are and probably set a slightly higher target.
Europe's two biggest economies, Germany and France, are going to hit that 2% target this year. You mentioned that some countries are paying more. Would Germany and France, do you think, be willing to step up and pay more than the 2% that NATO needs?
It's a big question. I mean, both France and both of the Germanys, West and East Germany, in the Cold War spent far more than 2%, closer to 4 or 5% at the peak of the Cold War. It's a real question as to whether they're willing to shoulder that burden. You know, in Germany, it's been a real struggle for them to get to 2%. And they've had to do this thing called the turning point, or in German, the Zeitenwende, where they've actually tried to take defense much more seriously than they have over the past decade. Can they reach 2% in a sustainable way? That's the big question. And then can they exceed that? Because they are going to need, as the biggest economies in Europe, they are going to need to shoulder more of that burden. And if Macron really has a vision for European autonomy, especially in the threat of a Trump administration, they're going to have to spend more than 2%. I think you're absolutely right.
All right, given that Germany and France, the two biggest economies, are finding it tough, what about the smaller economies? I mean, in tough economic times, I mean, surely these countries have other priorities, don't they?
Well, I think you're right, except if, as a nation, if you're going to try to make a choice between being able to defend your country and prosperity, you know, if you really see that as a dichotomy, then you make with neither defense nor prosperity. Ultimately, Russia and China, these countries are really putting tremendous pressure on Europe from a defense point of view, and these countries have to defend themselves in order to ensure their future prosperity. So for me, that's not really a trade-off. You have to be able to defend yourself in order to really be able to stand up in this security environment. And again, the nations of the Middle East understand this. There's very few nations in the Middle East that spend under 2%.
What about a country like Canada, whose economy is relatively healthy, and yet it is lagging behind in defense spending?
Absolutely. And, you know, ultimately, it comes down to your threat perception. And I think Canada, because it's in North America, because it has always sort of, you know, taken a minor role in global power projection, I think it just sees itself as being safe, as being almost, you know, contented with the way things are. But as they come under more pressure, as they see the Russians and the Chinese showing up in the Arctic Circle, as they feel more pressure in the future, I think that will change. But really, it comes down to the population. If the population really believes they're under threat, then defense money becomes much easier to spend, which is why, for instance, Poland can spend so much more because there is popular support for defense, whereas in Canada, you've pointed to it exactly. Because their security perceptions are different, they just haven't come around to that point yet.
William, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much.
The military leaders of Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso are hoping that their new confederation will help them to tackle their economic and security vulnerabilities. It comes just months after they broke away from the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS. Their exit has raised concerns about the future of the regional body and its plans for the free movement of goods and people across the region. ECOWAS at its recent summit acknowledged the risk of its disintegration, but it says it's still committed to talks with the new grouping. Barbara Angopa reports.
Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso, three military governments, three of the world's poorest economies, and all three have left the Economic Community of West African States to form their own alliance, the Confederation of Sahel States.
In the current geopolitical context, this remains the only sub-regional grouping that's efficient in counter-terrorism, as ECOWAS has been particularly lacking in this fight.
To do so, they plan to set up a joint military force. They say the alliance will allow them to throw off the yoke of colonialism.
Africa is a continent that has suffered and continues to suffer due to imperialists. For them, Africans belong to them. Our land belongs to them. They've never been able to change their ways until now.
And they want to pool their resources to encourage development, setting up agriculture, food security, water, energy and mining projects. They also want to create a currency, the Sahel. The World Bank says growth in Niger is possible if the divorce is well handled, security remains stable and oil exports are effective. But it's not so optimistic about Mali and Burkina Faso. ECOWAS says the departure will be a major blow to security cooperation and economic stability.
On the economic and financial level, the withdrawal of the 3 member states could lead to the suspension of all projects implemented by ECOWAS in these countries, whose value is estimated at more than $500 million.
But years of crippling sanctions by ECOWAS motivated the trio's departure. Sanctions were imposed beginning in 2021 following the military coups. They cut the countries off from their trading partners and caused hardship among the people, described by humanitarian organizations as collective punishment. They were lifted in February this year to try and entice the 3 to stay in ECOWAS, but it was too late. Like the newly formed Confederation of Sahel States, ECOWAS wants to introduce a single currency, entirely replacing the West African franc, a remnant of the colonial era. Despite sanctions, the 3 countries contributed 8% of ECOWAS annual output, so their exit would be a disruption. And the countries are leaning towards Russia and away from former colonial power, France. Barbara Angopa, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Joining us now from Accra in Ghana is Daniel Amatea Anim, who's President and Chief Economist at the Policy Initiative for Economic Development in Africa and an economic and policy think tank. Good to have you with us, Daniel. So what will be the economic impact then of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger's decision to withdraw from ECOWAS?
Thank you very much. As it stands, the countries you've just outlined, that is Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, contributes about 8% of the regional bloc's GDP, which is about 761 billion USD. And as it stands now, Burkina Faso and Niger, they are the major producer of tomatoes and onions within the bloc. And even at the time when the announcement came, immediately we have experienced, especially those of us in Ghana, experienced a sharp decline in supply of tomatoes and onions, and as well as increases in the prices of these products. And as it stands now, the prices of tomatoes and onions is very high and in short demand in Ghana. So what it means is that as much as they are only 3 countries, but because of their strategic position in terms of these 2 products that can easily outlined, what it means is that economically it will weaken and derail ECOWAS' effort to have a very strong economic bloc to be able to improve the living standards of the citizens. So not only that, if you take Burkina Faso, mostly they use the Tema Harbor for exportation, and we have, over the past, we used to see a lot of trucks, okay, from Tema to Burkina Faso. It has reduced in recent times. What it means is that it's affecting the income generation ability of Ghana. Okay, so as much as there are only 3 countries, I'm of the view that economically their exits will deepen the woes of the bloc. So that is not too good for ECOWAS as an economic bloc.
And Daniel, how much of a threat does this pose then to ECOWAS's plans to form an economic union across the region? Is that now over? That plan gone? I mean, and to what extent does ECOWAS only have itself to blame here?
I think the approach in terms of dealing with the coup d'etats was not forthcoming, and the least expected that these military leaders have resolved to indeed shift away from the phenomenon in terms of the activities of ECOWAS. So the approach, which was to attack, use a military force to kind of destabilize the coup d'etats or this military government, to me, it was something which was not too appropriate. And by the time they withdrawn from that particular approach, it was too late for them. What is needful for ECOWAS is to further engage in diplomacy, try to convince them that, look, we can only succeed as a bloc when we are together rather than when we deplete. Even as a bloc, we have so many economic challenges, issues of stability, security, and issues of health and education.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a need for us to be able to come together and deal with these particular issues.
And is anyone stepping into the breach to offer an economic partnership to the Sahel? I'm thinking here particularly of Russia.
Definitely so. You recall the very moment they announced their exit in recent times, Russia started engaging these countries. And what it means is that Russia promising to provide them with security, to provide them with military weapons and economic support. And that is what is making it even very difficult for them to change their mind in terms of coming back to the bloc once they're having Russia behind them. And then don't forget, Russia have a very huge interest on the continent, but because of the colonial relationship of the continent with the West and then other colonial powers, it's becoming very difficult for them to have that particular presence. So they see this one as an opportunity for them to be able to announce and establish their presence on the continent.
And Daniel, do you expect other countries to abandon the CFA franc as Burkina Faso, Niger and Mali have done? And how will a common currency between the three of them work, given the security situation in the region just now?
If you recall, just like I indicated earlier, most of these countries rely on Ghana and Nigeria in terms of their supplies. And when they are cutting down, it will affect the economies of these countries. And once they could get whatever they want from Russia or any other country, that will make them to become economically very strong and will further derail or diminish ECOWAS' effort in terms of its economic integration. And that would not be too good for the bloc as it stands now.
Daniel, it's been great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Equally grateful.
Boeing has agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to defraud the US Federal Aviation Administration and pay a fine, likely avoiding a long public trial. This is in connection with the regulatory approval of its 737 MAX that was followed by 2 plane crashes off the coast of Indonesia and in Ethiopia. The US Justice Department says that a fraud conviction will hold Boeing accountable for misstatements it made to regulators. But a lawyer representing some of the victims' relatives called the deal a slap on the wrist. They want a trial and action against company leaders. So, what lies ahead for Boeing? We'll explore it all with an aviation analyst in just a moment. But first, a report from Imogen Kimber.
Agreeing to plead guilty to fraud, Boeing is to pay the US Justice Department $243.6 million for breaking the terms of their settlement in 2021. The government had agreed at the time not to prosecute if Boeing paid $2.5 billion and successfully completed a 3-year probation period. The US government had charged Boeing in 2021 with 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the Federal Aviation Administration over a flawed safety system. This followed 2 Boeing 737 MAX jets crashing within months of each other in 2018 and 2019, killing 346 people. Just as the period of monitoring was coming to an end, a door blew off a Boeing 737 MAX 9 jet mid-flight in the first week of 2024. This opened up questions on whether the company had made the safety improvements required. Boeing says it is sorry and will prioritise safety.
I would like to speak directly to those who lost loved ones on Lion Air Flight 610 and the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. I would like to apologize on behalf of all of our Boeing associates. I want you to know we are totally committed in their memory to work and focus on safety. for as long as we're employed by Boeing.
The latest plea deal allows Boeing to avoid a criminal trial. For 3 years, it has to be overseen by a government-appointed independent monitor and spend $455 million to improve safety. No individuals in the company face criminal charges. Families of the crash victims are unhappy with the agreement.
This is not about compensation, but about humanity, about human lives. If Boeing took the deal, Boeing does not have a conscience. They must take responsibility. Consequences must be applied according to the laws in the US. They have to be criminally charged.
Boeing is crucial to the US economy and is the nation's largest exporter by value. 37% of its revenue comes from US government contracts, including foreign military sales. There's also NASA, with whom it has business in the billions. Although the Starliner space project is beset with problems, costing Boeing $1.5 billion in losses. A guilty plea potentially limits Boeing's ability to secure government contracts, but agencies have the power to waive restrictions. A federal judge will now decide whether to accept the plea deal. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Counting the Cost.
Joining us now from Singapore is Graham Ong Webb. He's an aviation analyst and adjunct fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Good to have you with us again, Graham. As we heard, a lawyer representing the victims' families has called this deal a slap on the wrist. Is that how you see it?
Well, my heart goes out to the families of, the victims of the 737 MAX crashes. I mean, 346 lives. The loss of any life is non-trivial. Life is intrinsically precious, and my heart goes out to them. And I think, this is a sham of a deal. And in my own personal view, I think the families should reject, should put pressure to ensure that this plea deal is not accepted. Listening to the clip earlier on, I mean, Boeing can and has to do better in terms of its lax safety standards and the lapses that we've seen in short order over the last few years. Because all of us depend on air travel, and we are cornered by duopolists, the likes of Boeing and Airbus, and I think it's incumbent on the aviation sector in general, and for these two companies, and for Boeing in particular, to do a lot better than it has in the past.
Are there enough measures in this deal to, at the very least, ensure improvements in quality and safety?
Well, the proof is always in the pudding. As we know, the FAA and Boeing officials or Boeing leaders came together recently to work out a plan of action to improve the standards, the safety culture, and the other processes that impinge on the quality of Boeing's commercial aircraft in an 11-page roadmap. But it remains to be seen. I think the intention of the roadmap is the right one, to take Boeing to task and to ensure stronger oversight on what is a crucial company, not just to the US economy, but to people all around the world who, as I mentioned earlier on, depend on the likes of Boeing's aircraft and Airbus's aircraft to take us around to our desired destinations. And so this roadmap, I think, it's a good start, but I think it remains to be seen whether those improvements bear fruit and whether or not Boeing's track record gets back onto the right track as we go along.
You say that Boeing's crucial to the US economy. Is it too big to fail?
I think it is. This is a company that's been around since 1916. It is, in terms of the defense side of the business, as we know very well, Boeing is a juggernaut of a company, and it's really cut and cleaved into two parts. It has a commercial airlines or commercial aviation business. We know a lot about that, quite notoriously so. And of course, it's this defense, space, and security business, which constitutes about 44% of its business. Now, the bulk of this business does come from US contracts. So essentially, Boeing sits at the heart of the United States military-industrial complex. It plays a critical role providing cutting-edge technologies in terms of military-grade aircraft, satellite systems, missile technology, and the like. And so in that regard, Boeing is rather too large to fail. One can expect that the US government will try to give Boeing that push or helping hand, if you will, accelerate government military contracts to ensure that Boeing, gets its a steady chunk of its revenue stream to, help Boeing to buffer the storms that it's facing right now.
Okay, what damage has this done to Boeing's business in terms of revenue, but also in terms of reputation? And what does Boeing need to do to repair that reputation? Can it be done?
Well, anything's possible. I think with the commitment to really make a tangible change, a tangible difference, an inflection in the practices, the manufacturing processes, and the safety culture within Boeing, which clearly is much to be desired right now. That Boeing can turn around and regain some of that lost ground. I mean, right now, as we speak, Airbus is gaining increasing market share. I mean, this is possibly salad days for Airbus now. It's a range of aircraft, are increasingly popular among air travelers. This is anecdotal information, of course, from my observation of consumers, customers in the commercial aviation industry. People heap significant amount of praise on the experience flying on Airbus's range of aircraft, whether it's the A320 or the A330, the A350, etc. Boeing, I think, is taking a bit of a hit here because people are getting onto an aircraft, a Boeing aircraft, with some amount of trepidation, asking themselves, is this going to be a safe flight? So this is still anecdotal. I think it's still bubbling underneath the surface, but customers are king.
Always great to talk to you on Counting the Cost, Graham. Many thanks indeed for being with us again.
My pleasure.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at @afinnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, or you could drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.